So welcome everyone. It's really great to have you along to this session. I guess these sessions conventionally start with the words, I've really been looking forward to this session. But I actually mean that from the heart, because Graeme is I was going to say an old friend, a long-term friend of mine. We actually met through a mastermind group established through a mutual friend of ours, probably 15 years ago, maybe more. And we were all speakers and international speakers. And by that I mean from around the world, who got together, and we met for a day or two in different locations around the world to help each other understand our business and to help improve our businesses. And it was just brilliant. This is where I met Graeme, and we met in Johannesburg, we met in Birmingham, I think, Graeme, if my memory is correct. We met in Dubai and we met in New York. We actually didn't meet in Australia, but maybe we could do that when all this is over. But I've been looking forward to this because Graeme has, I think, truly wonderful insights. And more than that, he's able to share his insights very articulately. He's very well read. And if we're thinking about the future, my belief is Graeme is right up there in terms of the world's best, in terms of helping share insights about what the future might bring. So, Graeme, having said that, the expectations are now higher than they were prior to us starting. It's great to have you here, Graeme. And look, we want this to be a conversation. There will be a presentation component from Graeme, but we do want this to be a conversation. We don't want to sit there and lecture at you. So if you have any comments or questions, please put them in the chat box. I'll be reviewing those. And certainly Graeme and I will be having a conversation as well. So Graeme, it's great to have you here. I don't know if any of you can see that we are having a little bit of a trouble with somebody proclaimed to be Graeme coming in every now and then. I don't know if this is bombing or what, but I'll keep an eye on that, Graeme.
We're both keeping our eye on it. The only Graeme that's supposed to be speaking is me, the one that is speaking. So anybody else who's trying to get in, this is the only downside of doing this the way we've done it, which is to create an open Zoom session. We wanted to do that because we wanted all of you to join in the conversation. But because it looks as if somebody's trying to bomb us, we're not going to be able to open up completely. So as Steve said, please put your questions and comments into the chat box and we'll pick it up as we go along. We're not even going to leave the questions right to the end. We'll bring them in. But today you're going to need to just put it into the chat box for us. There's no, at one level, there's no real reason to share my screen and show slides because we're having a conversation. But just for those of you who need something visual to get us going, let me just start with a little bit of an intro. As Steve said, I am a futurist. That's what it says on my business card. That doesn't mean I can predict the future. Sadly, I wish I could. But what it means is that I track trends. And I attempt, together with my team at a company called Tomorrow Today Global, we attempt to try and understand where the trends are that are going. In fact, most futurists are more historians because we look at what is already happening, but maybe happening in another part of the world that you're not keeping an eye on, maybe happening in a different industry that you're not familiar with. But if we can spot some patterns, we can give you a heads up. And that basically has been our job for the last 20 years. As it happens, 15 years ago in a book that our team wrote, we included a scenario about a pandemic shutting down all of the world's travel. And as early as 1 year ago, we as a team, we put out monthly scenarios. We call them news bulletins from the future. We just try and get people thinking. So recent ones have been Estonia electing a computer program to be their president, and somebody in Japan celebrating their 150th birthday. And these are meant to jump you into the future and think about how the world is changing. And then obviously we bring you back to the present day and say, how does that impact you today? And Steve, I put forward a suggestion to my team that we put together a scenario around a global pandemic that was taking over the world. and shut down most of the world's harbors and put it into quarantine. Genuinely, I can send everybody the script to this little 3-minute video that I proposed to the team in about April last year. And the team said, this is too crazy. Nobody will believe it. And what are people supposed to do with it, even if they read it? So the interesting thing, and this is important, I suppose, at one level, is that people have been predicting this. Whenever President Obama was asked, what is your biggest nightmare? What's the thing that keeps you up at night? He always answered a global pandemic that shuts the world down. And in fact, when he handed over to President Trump, by law, the American president has to brief the incoming team of the new president on what they think the biggest issue is. And this was the biggest issue. And the briefing was given. So it's not as if we didn't know what was coming. And I'd actually want to come back to that point, because if we could say, well, we could have known this was coming, then maybe there's a question about how do we prepare better for other things that might be coming. But the reason we didn't do much more preparation than we did is because some things are just too big to prepare for. So, even if I'd come to a company and said last year there's going to be a pandemic, what would they have done? It's too big an issue to prepare for. So we are where we are, right? As my teenage daughters would say, and I'm not sure I'm going to get the accent right, it is what it is, this is where we are. And so the big question now is what happens next? And this is what our team does. And so what we've been trying to do is to ask 2 questions. And that's what I'll quickly want to take you through, and then we can have some conversation. So the first question is what do we expect in the next few weeks? And by few weeks, I don't mean 2 or 3 weeks. I mean maybe 10 to 20 weeks. Let's even say maybe the rest of this year. Of course, most countries are in some version of lockdown. And I realize this is now very variable across the world. So Sweden, actually, who's been a darling of some people who didn't want lockdown, is actually going into more of a lockdown as of yesterday. Their herd immunity approach has not worked. Germany is coming out of lockdown. Spain is coming out of lockdown. America doesn't know whether it wants to be in lockdown or not, and it's variable via states. In Australia, of course, Western Australia has locked down the state, but is easing up of some of the restrictions inside Perth and so on. So, it's almost impossible now, as somebody who's trying to keep a global view, to say that there is no consistency around the world, except to say that you're probably in some version of self-lockdown or state-imposed lockdown. And the real issue right now, there are 2 issues. The one is your medical system ready for a possible second wave, or in some cases in the Southern Hemisphere, possibly even the first wave? Because we've been in summer down south here in the Southern Hemisphere, we haven't been hit hard yet. And we have to understand that. If you're a Game of Thrones fan, winter is coming. And it is going to be bad, right? Because this is a winter disease. We don't have a vaccine. We don't even have medicine. You can only treat the symptoms of this thing, which is normally pretty bad pneumonia, and for the people who actually get this and feel sick, and that's about 20%. So 20% of us, if we got it, would feel very sick. There's no cure for this thing. You just have to ride it out. And those people who get it and get severe symptoms say it's a nasty, nasty thing. It affects your cognitive ability, your thinking ability, and it takes you out of action for 8 to 10 weeks. So by the way, those of you who've got a little notepad and are jotting down notes, maybe there's your first note. What would you do as a business if some of your people were taken out for 8 to 10 weeks? So obviously there's some people that have to go on ventilators, and we're desperately concerned about them actually living. That's about 1% of people who get it. But there's a chunk, 19, 20% of people who are out of operation for 2 months because of this. Luckily for us, the other 80% of people, basically, you either have mild symptoms, which is just a few days of feeling a little bit iffy, or you have no symptoms at all, which is what an insane disease that it's got this broad spectrum of impacts on different people. So until we either have a vaccine or we have herd immunity, which basically means that those people who have been impacted by it have already been impacted, and the rest of us can kind of just get on with our lives. Either way, that's about 18 months away at the earliest. Even if we discover a vaccine today, it's still got to go through 6 to 9 months of testing, and you cannot speed up that testing process. If we get a vaccine wrong, we make it worse, much worse, because a vaccine is either poison or Red Bull to a disease, and you wouldn't want to be injecting coronavirus Red Bull into anybody. So you've got to get the vaccine right. So that's why we've been talking about flattening the curve, right? That's what we've all been talking about. We know a lot of people are going to get this. We know that about 20% of people are going to get it badly. We know that about 2% of people are going to have to go to hospital when they get it. And if your country's healthcare system can't handle that, you get overwhelmed, and then all sorts of other issues get added on top of that. So far, so good. In most countries, there have been a few hotspots: New York, UK, Italy, Ecuador, but most other places we've been able to handle things. So what do we expect for the next few months? The key thing now for the next, and Steve, I think this is the big message I want to get across to people, and probably where our conversation is going to head towards, is this is probably the rest of next year. It's definitely the rest of this year. It's 12 to 18 months that we are going to have to keep this dynamic balance now. Let this picture sink into your heads. This is what your world is going to be like for the next 12 to 18 months. There's 3 sets of balances here, Steve. The first balance is the balance between what here in South Africa, there's been big arguments about what they call lives versus livelihoods. It's the balance between the lockdown of the economy and whether the lockdown of the economy is starting to kill more people than the disease was. So that's the first level, but I think that that's a false dichotomy. I think the second balance is more important. It's the balance of how do you open up the economy, or which bits of the economy can you open up while still keeping yourself and other people safe at the same time. And that needs to be the conversation now. Nobody is fighting anybody else on this one. We all agree we have to get the economy going and we have to keep ourselves safe. And you cannot argue that this is an insignificant disease. It's not. But you can't argue that we got to stay locked down in our houses for the next 18 months, because you can't do that either. Every health decision has an economic impact, and every economic decision has a health impact. So we've got to find the balance. And so the third balance is really about timing. And that balance comes down to, I think, the simplest way of talking about it, and I don't think it's simplistic, is how do you keep physical distancing? Steve, can I ask you, do you guys in Australia, do you talk about social distancing or physical distancing?
Social.
Yeah, I think we made a big mistake with the label, right? We shouldn't be socially distancing from each other. We can't as human beings. We're social creatures. So I'm on a bit of a campaign to change the label. Because it's physical distancing but social connecting, right? It's physical distancing but getting back to work. It's physical distancing but going to school. If you don't, here's the only graph. If you can look at your screens, if you haven't been, just look at this graph. This is the only graph that the news bulletin should show every day. The number of infections and deaths and everything per day through COVID-19 is such a variable number. Are our governments reporting the numbers accurately? Are our hospitals recording them accurately? I'm not sure that we're sure. But I know for sure that 100 years ago, this graph is correct. It might be difficult to read. Let me make it easier for you. Sorry, that's not great resolution on my screen. This is Spanish flu, or better called 1918-1919 flu, from 100 years ago. And Steve, quick test for you, and maybe we can throw this out to everybody else in the chat box. I know that these labels are not difficult to see, but you got first wave, second wave, third wave. Where do you think we are with COVID? So if this was the COVID curve, COVID-19 curve, where do you think we are in terms of time and where we are on first, second, or third wave?
Go into the chat box. I'm very scared of the answer here, Graeme, but you can go to the chat box. Where are we, first, second, or third? So you can put just a number, first, second, or third.
So just for those who might need to be caught up, hopefully everybody's heard of the Spanish flu so far. Right now, your local news channels should be talking about this. This was end of World War I. A flu suddenly arrives in the field hospitals in France. We think it was because of the pigs and the chickens that were brought to feed the troops. But because it was a coronavirus, actually it was H1N1. It was the flu virus that we know today. It jumped from the animals into the field hospitals, and this was a nasty brute of a disease. 24 hours. You got it, you showed symptoms, you were infectious, you were dead. And by the end of the third wave, close to 50 million people around the world were infected. The first wave happened when all of the troops were sent home. So this was literally the end of World War I, and the troops were sent home and they took it with them, and then infected people all around the world. It was called the Spanish flu because Spain had been neutral in World War I. And they were the only country who reported on it accurately. Everybody else suppressed the reporting because they didn't want to panic people after World War I. So then everybody thought that they had dealt with it. And then as winter hit hard, it came back again. And it just spread all around the world, and that's when the majority of people died. And then, because I'm a South African and you're an Australian, Steve, I have to do this one. So the third wave came. So Australia thought that they had sorted themselves out. They created a quarantine for the whole country. Of course, there were no flights at that time. This was 1918, 1919. So they literally blockaded ships. As Australians, you didn't allow any ships to come into any of your ports. And you protected yourself from both the first and the second wave. And then, and this might sound familiar, and it did start in Melbourne, as it happens, people began to shout at the government to say, well, you can't shut down our ports for so long. You've got to let people in. Look, there's the flu is subsiding. Let people in. And you let ships in Australia, and it hit you hard. Within 2 weeks, you had more than 12,000 deaths across Sydney and Perth and Melbourne. And then all those ships restocked and went back to Europe, and Australia exported the disease back to Europe.
Wow.
And Australia was the cause of the third wave. So anyway, I had to do that. Sorry, Steve. I wouldn't normally put that in a presentation, but I thought as a South African, got to stick the boot in for the third wave last time. Okay, so we've given people a chance. Where do you think we are? Steve, have you got a consensus view? And what do you think?
One, someone is saying third wave. Someone else is saying only past peak of the first. So yeah, generally around the.
Well, there's your winner. There's your winner. Whoever said that, we're only just past the peak of the first wave, people. We've had the first wave, and down in the southern hemisphere, because we got onto it quickly, and because we were in summer through into autumn, we dodged a bullet. Second wave still coming. You cannot fight this graph. Every single flu virus, the Hong Kong flu of 1957, the Asian flu of 1968, swine flu, SARS, MERS, bird flu, they follow exactly the same process. And if we're learning anything from history, we need to learn that we can't get out of the second. We've got to watch out for the second wave and even the third after that. So what does this mean? Well, it means that we can't just send our schools back, right? You can't just say, everybody, okay, everybody, looks like we've dealt with it, everybody get back to school. You guys are not doing that in Australia. We're not doing that in South Africa. UK is not doing that. America's not doing that. Singapore's not doing that.
We're starting, Graeme. We're starting to send them back.
Yeah, but you're phasing them in, aren't you?
Correct.
So it's not every, and that's what I mean, Steve. So it's not as if everybody's going back. It's you're phasing in a few year groups at a time. There's no after school activities, although as somebody said, you know, if you're not allowed physical distancing, well, then at least we can play cricket, right? Because nobody gets close to anybody else in cricket, and you're all standing around doing nothing anyway. As a cricket fan, I took huge offense to that. But I suppose it's true. So cricket might be the only sport. And of course, sports like tennis and so on, maybe we can play. But you can't play footy. You can't play rugby. You know, well, as a backline player myself, I suppose we you know, we didn't need the forwards anyway, so just scrap the scrums and we'll be fine. But you know, so schools are not going to be doing sports. They're not going to be doing after school activities. And in fact, most schools, as far as I can see, are asking students to come in on a reduced timetable anyway. Because, and this is the point, Steve, that I want to try and get to people. There are two main points I want to get across. The first is you have to physical distance. So you can only go back to a school that's got space to keep 2 meters between students in classrooms. Private schools might be able to do this. Some inner city schools, some public schools, some schools in poorer areas just can't do that. They don't have the space and the facilities. You've got to be able to keep the teachers safe in the staff room. Most staff rooms are small places that staff are crammed into. They can't do that anymore. What about using sport? We already talked sport, but sport is an analogy. You can't get people into a stadium unless they're 2 meters apart. So again, yeah, maybe you can go into some of the big stadiums we've got in our countries and limit the number of spectators and so on. But how do you keep the sports people themselves physically distanced? And if anybody on one team gets COVID, what do? Quarantine the whole team and shut down the team for 2 weeks. I mean, I think that's the only way you can do it. But imagine the scheduling chaos where you've got to keep adjusting the schedules every time somebody gets COVID on a team, because you've now got to take them out for 2 weeks quarantine again. So we've got to decide whether we can live that way. Now, I think we can, because I don't know about you, Steve. I can't live without live sport for too much longer. Desperate for it. But we're going to have to accept it's going to look very different. And most of us are not going to go and see it live. We're going to see it on TV. So that leads us to flying, right? I fly between 240 and 280 flights a year, traveling to over 30 countries a year. I am not getting on an airplane this year. My clients can throw all the money in the world that they like at me. And the reason for that is I have asthma. I am in a vulnerable group. My wife has glandular fever. Her last episode of it was 15 years ago. But we've looked at the medical situation, and she falls into a vulnerable group because it is a underlying immune system issue. And the younger people who are getting impacted by COVID are people with diabetes and heart conditions and any immune compromise situation. So both my wife and I, although we are fit and healthy, I was due to run the London Marathon this year. I am not putting myself in a situation where either I get knocked out for 2 months or I die. I mean, of course not. So not going to happen. And so if you can only fly, if you can guarantee physical distancing, even the people who are brave enough to fly are not going to be packing into an airplane where you're putting 150 people into economy class. You're going to have to keep spaces open. And maybe a restaurant will help you to imagine this one. If we've got to open restaurants, but only if we can keep 2 meter distance between tables, and 2-meter distance between the kitchen staff in the kitchen, well, maybe you can only operate at 1/3 or 1/2 capacity. And in fact, that's the problem. There are no right or wrong answers here. It's this dynamic balance, and everybody's going to have to make the balance. And that's the third balance that I'm talking about. And that, Steve, is where I want us to have a conversation. Now, I've got a few other things to talk about, but I want to pause here just for some conversation. Is the other balance is the balance between us opening up the economy legally. So your government gives you permission to open your business, to open your restaurant, to fly your airplanes and so on. But what happens if none of the customers come? What happens if customers are staying home and saying, well, I'm not doing that. You know, I want to keep myself safe. I will go somewhere where there's physical distancing. So you think, well, let me support my local restaurant that's just opened last night. And you go, and there's 1,000 other people trying to get into the restaurant, all with, and we're South Africans and Australians talking here, so let's use the language we want to talk, idiots, morons, bogans in your Australian language, who are all just pushing and shoving to try and get into the same pizza restaurant that you are. You're going to turn around and go home. And then tomorrow, you're not going to try it. And so the balance we've got to get is between, yes, opening the economy, but yes, building confidence in the fact that the economy is going to work without killing any of us. And that applies to every workplace. And from what I can see and from what some of the modeling is, that means that most workplaces, and by workplaces, I mean your office, I mean restaurants, I mean airplanes, probably need to be no more than 30 to 50% at the most, but probably 30% occupancy. Now, what does that mean for your business? What does that mean for the way that we work? I think it means that if you can stay at home and you can work from home, then you're probably going to be doing that for the next 12 to 18 months. And that means, Steve, we live in a very, very different world now, don't we?
Don't we what? That is just fascinating, Graeme. And as you're talking, it makes me wonder whether people are polarizing themselves and moving to one of the two camps. One camp is the conservative camp that wants to stay safe and won't go on an aeroplane, no matter whether that facility is open to use or not. But the other is a group of people who are sort of demanding it goes back to normal, and this is over. This whole thing is overstated. Like in Melbourne only a couple of days ago, we had a couple of hundred protesters on the steps of Parliament House.
I saw that.
I saw a newspaper article today which had a picture of a train in Adelaide that was like the COVID had never happened. It was standing room only, literally. So there's a group of people who think that this is overcooked, I guess, and who are desperate just for things to be normal. And then there's the conservative camp. I guess the numbers are more on the conservative side, but it's not all one way by any means, is it?
No, and Steve, as with everything in life, I suppose the truth is somewhere in between. Tasha has sent us a note. Only you and I can see it, but we can share it with everybody else. In WA, people have gone back to public and private schools, and yeah, I've got good mates, as every South African does. I've got lots of good mates who live in Perth. But again, the reason for that is because they're just jolly in the middle of nowhere. And they've been able to shut down the borders. I mean, if you travel outside of Perth, you've got to go through police roadblocks, right, to go anywhere. And so, yeah, well done to Perth and WA more in general. Because of your geographic location, you've been able to basically self-isolate an area rather than just home by home. And you've got to keep it that way. But you're going to let cruise ships into the harbour anytime in the next month or two? Kind of let everybody off and come to the stadium? You know, are you going to let guys come across from Melbourne for the footy? You know, let their teams in? You're going to let planes in at the airport? No. You know, so yes, well done. You've been able to contain it. And that really is what's going to happen now, suburb by suburb and city by city and office block by office block. we can look to contain and broaden our geographic footprint. But as soon as you do something stupid, like as you say, those trains in Adelaide, or I saw scenes in British Columbia, in Vancouver. They eased off, and everybody just went crazy for the weekend on the paths. We did the same here in Cape Town a week or two ago, where everybody just went to the Sea Point Promenade. We were told we were now allowed to exercise outside of our houses, and hundreds of thousands of people descended on the seafront.
Yeah.
And a week or two later, you are going to see coronavirus spiking. And as long as the hospitals are not overwhelmed, you kind of might want to say, oh, well, so be it. But you don't want to say that if you've got asthma or glandular fever, or you can't afford to be out of operation for 10 weeks because you're an entrepreneur. So, for me, I'm wanting to help people understand that the two extremes of open the economy, I want to go back to work, and stay at home, everybody's going to die, both of those extremes are wrong. And the dynamic balance is not us waiting for the government to tell us what to do. It's each of us in our families, our lives, everything from the tennis club to your church, from your office to your factory operations, being intelligent, careful, and deliberate about maintaining that balance. Work as hard as you can, but physical distance, wear your masks, keep safe. And this is the new reality for the next 12 to 18 months, until we get a vaccine or until we've passed the third wave.
Wow. So I'm really keen for everyone who's on board here to move into consideration of the business implications for this, both in terms of your staff, your people, and how you deal with your customers. So I don't know if that was part of your plan from here, Graeme, to start considering the business implications.
That's actually where I wanted to go, Steve, because I know that your expertise and what gets you up in the morning and gets you going is workplace culture and employee engagement. So I think that's a great place to start the conversation. Is what have you seen in the last little while as people have started to work from home? I think initially people thought it would just be a few weeks. And so you can kind of grit your teeth and kind of say, oh, well, this is not what we expected, so we'll get through this. And I kind of feel as if sort of the engine died a little while ago, but we're sort of coasting downhill and hoping that we can just make it home, But now we've realized home is a few months away now. And I think a lot of companies are going to struggle with their workplace culture if half or more of their staff have to work from home for the rest of the year. They haven't adjusted their leadership style enough. They haven't adjusted their team dynamics. I'm seeing people, sadly, I was expecting this, but I have heard of 2 people in the last few days in their 40s who've had heart attacks. And I know that that's because of the pressure, because companies have said, you've got to keep producing productivity. Your bonus is still on the line. We're still tracking your contribution. And now you've got kids working from home. You stressed out yourself because maybe you're nervous of the disease. You've got elderly parents you're worried about. And I just think we've gone into overdrive mode of people working way too hard, working well outside of any acceptable systems. And I don't know what you've seen, Steve. I think this is putting real stress now. And companies that didn't have a good workplace culture, I think this is going to hurt them badly in the next 2 months.
I think you're onto something there. I'm just having a look at some of the comments here because I don't want to miss your comments. Yeah. Graeme, I really think you're onto something there. We crafted 6 propositions to do with culture, and the conversation isn't all about culture, but one of the propositions we put was that there is a risk that the negative UGRs, the negative unwritten ground rules, in other words, the culture, people's perception of this is the way we do things around here, there is a risk in the current context that negative UGRs are magnified and can escalate. Yeah. Now, I think there's a very good reason for this, and that is that we've just gone through what we might call a frenzied activity zone. That is, once this hits, it is all hands on deck. How do we deal with this? How do we plug holes? How do we, I spoke with a senior leader from a major Australian franchise a couple of weeks ago. Graeme, the term he used, this is literally the term he used, because I rang him for no other reason to say, how are things going? He said, Steve, it's been a bloodbath. Now, my heart went out to this poor guy because he had to sack people. He'd had to help people transition to working from home. He'd been running on adrenaline probably for 3 or 4 weeks, and quite frankly was a candidate for the stress you're talking about, Graeme. Yeah. Now, everyone was doing that. Everyone is feeling fear, uncertainty, stress. I felt it to the maximum. So
Absolutely.
probably everyone else.
And Steve, this is something that does happen every now and again in a business. It can happen by design. If you're in the accounts department and it's year end and the auditors are there, you put your head down, you say goodbye to your family, you tell them it's a tough time, everybody understands, you get on with it. It could be the Christmas rush if you're a retailer. It could be, end of season. It could be if you're in education, it's the year end, it's the setting of exams and marking of exams. So it's not as if it's unexpected that you have a frenzied activity state. And it's not as if you can't handle it for a period of time. And then we say to everybody, thanks everybody, well played, take a holiday, take some leave, take 2 weeks off, summer holidays, or here's a bonus, well done. That's exactly what we were expecting of you. Except now we've said to people, hey guys, you had to do that, keep doing it. Sorry, don't leave your house. You can't go on leave. You've used up all of your holiday because we forced you to take your holiday as part of the way that we responded, et cetera, et cetera. So, sorry, I interrupted you, but I think this is what we're seeing, right, Steve? I'm seeing this with my clients, and this is why I'm desperately trying to get them to understand. Guys, this is not a short-term issue we're dealing with. You're running at sprint pace now. This is a marathon. You're going to die.
100%. And the difference between those normal disruptions and this is that this was not predictable, and this is uncertainty in terms of there's massive uncertainty in terms of its duration. Now, I think we're starting to move out of this frenzied activity zone to a post-shock zone. And my fear is that as we move to this post-shock zone, that the activity that's kept leaders busy is all that they focus on. It's probably understandable that culture becomes a second or third tier priority during a frenzied activity zone. It's just, how can we fix these problems up? What can we do? But my fear is that now, in this post-shock zone, the culture remains forgotten and people remain getting busy. So I think that's a real threat. And that's in the context where my personal belief is that there has never been a more important time than now when culture ought to be focused on. So it's a really interesting time. So look, I'm just reading some of the comments here.
Yeah, go for it. There's some, Anne made a good contribution to say we need to be talking about PTSD.
Yes.
Absolutely. I think people are dealing with a way more trauma than they think. Sadly, one of the reasons why there are a lot of South Africans in Australia is because, we've lived in a stressful country for 50 years, to be honest, 100 years. South Africa's a tough place to live. It's not a tough place to live if you're rich, and it hasn't been a tough place to live if you're white in history, but it's always been a tough environment. And you live with low-level anxiety. And we as South Africans are proof that you can live with low-level anxiety without too many side effects, Some of South Africans, we're all messed up. So maybe you're laughing and saying, no, Graeme, we can see the effects. But when you ramp that low-level anxiety up to even medium-level anxiety, it's too much. And that's what the whole world is experiencing. So please, just from a South African who knows what it's like to live in a time of stress all the time, you can't keep this up. something snaps, something breaks in you and in your communities. And leaders need to step away from the frenzy of doing what needed to be done because there was a crisis, and step back and say, right, my role now as a leader is very different. Steve, I agree with you. One of the things they have to look at is employee engagement. You can't just say to people, well, if you don't want to work hard, there are plenty of people out of work, I can replace you. I've literally heard people saying that. That's horrific. That's not going to work long term. Please, you've got to, we don't even need to explain why that's a problem. But I also think, Stephen, and I'd be interested to talk about this as well, I think that the leadership style has to change. Our team at Tomorrow Today has been really keen for 10 years or more on a concept called adaptive leadership. Came out of Harvard University, a guy called Ron Heifetz a number of years ago. The concept is very simple. Most leaders are what we would call technical leaders. And that doesn't mean they're artisans and plumbers and technicians. Technical leadership is when if we can diagnose the problem and we can all agree on what the problem is, and then we can analyze that problem and we can all agree on what the solution is. And even if it's a complex solution, we're all agreed on what the solution is. And then you get experts in, you get expertise. And this is why somebody with 10 years or 20 years of experience in the business is the best leader, because they've been there, they've done that, they've experienced stuff like this before. They apply their expertise, their professionals training, and they solve the problem. And I mean, this is what you want from a fireman, right? Your house is on fire, the fireman arrives. You want somebody who jumps out of the fire truck and says, awesome, I've seen a fire like this 100 times before. In fact, I've just come from one. Step back, I know what I'm doing. You want this with a brain surgeon, right? You also want this with an accountant. You don't want an accountant to look at your bank account and say, I don't know what's happened. You know, you want them to know exactly what's going on. You want them to know exactly what's happening with the numbers. But what happens, and here, I wish I could see everybody's faces, because then I could know how hard to push my cheeky tone of voice now, because I've spent the last 15 years having to take the first half of every session I've done with clients, trying to prove to them they're in an adaptive environment. What happens if you and your company are in a situation where actually you don't really know what the problem is? The stuff you were doing isn't working anymore, but you don't know why. Even when you get all the best people in your team together and you think you've got an idea of what the problem is, none of you can agree on the solution. There's 20 things you could do, and all of them have merit. You really don't know how to choose between them, but you've got a budget proposal to put in, so you have to. And then when you do the things you had planned to do, you realize that the people who said they knew what they were doing don't actually have a clue, and they don't know what they're doing. And this includes your CEO. So, you know, I've been trying to tell banks and, retailers and people in education for the last 10, 15 years, you are actually in an adaptive environment. At least now I don't have to have that conversation anymore, because everybody knows it. But the question is your leadership style adaptive? And so I was just doing some work with a bank literally yesterday, where they were trying, now they're an investment bank, they're getting out of the crisis zone, well done to them. They're looking ahead at 2021, 2022, and they're trying to think, who's going to need investment? Where are our future customers? So we were asking questions like, is government going to be interventionist or hands-off? Are government going to be protectionist and nationalistic in the future, or are we going to go back to globalization? And the answer was, we've got no idea. We've got no idea. And 3 months from now, we might have a better idea, but my boss needs a budget proposal by Friday. And so I was stepping back and saying, guys, your problem is not trying to predict what's happening with COVID. Your problem is you don't know what adaptive leadership looks like. You can't work in an environment where you have a budget for 3 different possibilities, and you only apply the budget when you know which possibility is working. You have no idea how to work in an adaptive environment. And so I think we've got to help people right now to stop being scared of COVID and stop focusing only on crisis response, and step back and think about different leadership styles and different styles of engagement with their staff. Sorry, that was supposed to be a question to you to start with, turned into a bit of a lecture, but I don't know what your thoughts are on leadership and styles of leadership.
Well, that's really good. Our thinking is that there now, in our current circumstances, there now needs to be 4 non-negotiable cultural attributes that just about every organisation on the planet ought to be fighting for. And they are transparency in the face of fear, uncertainty and stress. People need to feel that the organisation is being transparent, both for them personally and for the organisation. And transparency means also saying, I don't know if that's the actual answer. Next is agility, because if you're not able to move quickly now and respond fast now, you're in deep trouble. The other is creativity and innovation, because if you aren't being creative and innovative now, you can guarantee your competitors are. And the fourth one, and probably the most important, is support and / care. Because again, in the face of this enormous stress and fear and uncertainty that people are feeling, they must feel cared for. Now, it gets very complicated around that whole dimension of care and support. And I think this is part of adaptive leadership, by the way. It gets very complicated because through the vehicle of interaction now, we need and are using a whole set of different cues to pick up what the cultural cues are. So, for example, as a new employee pre-COVID, I would look at how meetings run, do people interact, different points of view raised, what is said immediately after the meeting. These are all ingrained into our heads, these various cues, punctuality, how bosses treat staff, what happens when things are under pressure and so on. These are all cues that we tune into. Now we have to use a whole set of different cues via a computer screen in the main to pick up what the cues are. And it's very dangerous because while we've been promoting each of you guys to use the chat box, I think this is a very dangerous component of our communication. I've been attending webinars forever over the last couple of months, and I am gobsmacked about how during presentations by people, there are chats happening that are jokes and conversations about topics that are totally independent of what the presentation is about. Now, if that happened in a face-to-face meeting, we'd be going, hello, do you want to join us?
Yeah.
But the game, it's almost like we have to teach people how to be participants in virtual meetings now. It's almost from scratch. So I'm raising that point because the rules have changed, the cues have changed, and that means leadership needs to change. And I think it's part of this adaptive leadership that you're talking about, Graeme.
Yeah. No, 100%. And I would go even further to say with support and care, which I 100% agree with. I really like those 4 attributes you've talked about there. I think that, so let's say you say to your employees, right, come back to work now if you can. So in Perth, for example, might be easier to do. But the schools maybe haven't gone back yet. And then the parent says, but I don't have childcare. Or the person themselves might say, well, I feel comfortable that I could get back to work, but I have to use public transport. And I don't want to do that. Or I do want to come back to work and it seems to be safe, but I have an elderly parent who lives with me at home. So I'd be okay, but I don't want to put my household at risk. At what level does this become an HR conversation and a leadership conversation? And at what point do you have not just a cultural attribute of care, but a duty of care to say to that person, let's have this conversation. It's not a conversation we would have had 6 months ago, but I want to have a conversation about your kids, your parents, your living arrangements. And at what level then do you as an employer say, this is my responsibility or not?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Look, I'm keen for you guys who are on board to be involved in this as well.
I've been looking and sent something just to you and me, which I've sent out. I think I'm going to go and have a look at that Kellogg Institute article. It was somebody just talking about the economic cost of opening up the economy if you get it wrong. So that'd be worth looking at. And I think it's just adding to the point that we've made, which is the point I'm wanting to leave with people, that the balance is not between the two extreme views. We know we have to get the economy going, but we know that we have to care for people in the process as well. You've had a chance to read what Carla said there, Steve?
I have. Carla is saying that people are just ticking stuff off the list, which is simply not good enough for culture and mental health and well-being. Well, that's a really good point, Carla.
So, Steve, actually in that, one of the things about adaptive leadership that maybe people can think about is two of the first things that people do that show they're not adaptive leaders. So in the face of a crisis or an unexpected adaptive challenge, the first thing is that people skip the diagnosis phase. So they go straight to activities that try and solve the problem without fully diagnosing the problem. And I've seen a little bit of the work that you do in companies, and I think that would probably be something that you've seen over and over again. You know, staff members are not being productive. So bosses think, this must be a bonuses issue. We haven't given people enough bonuses or whatever. And so they jump to solutions that maybe worked a year ago or 3 years ago, or worked in a different industry, or they try and copy it because they heard Apple did it or Google did it, and they don't really actually diagnose the problem. And the second thing that the mistake they make is they get busy with what we call busy work. It's actually work avoidance, because the work that they're avoiding is the hard work. It's the hard work of actually engaging with the real problem. It's the hard work of dealing with people's real issues.
Yeah.
It's the hard work of listening to what your staff are actually telling you. And instead of doing that, we dive into the work we're familiar with. So we dive into going on sales calls and phoning customers and having more meetings and doing a tighter budget and doing our vision and mission statements again, because we think maybe that's why people are not engaging properly. And we put on training courses without really knowing what training we're supposed to be doing, but we do the training courses that worked 5 years ago. And so I think this is what Carla's talking about. It's that busy work of just doing stuff, because that makes us feel validated and nobody can shout at us because we're not being lazy. But yeah, you know, if you're busy putting a ladder up and climbing up the ladder, it might be worthwhile working out whether the ladder's against the right wall, you know, before you get to the top of it. Yeah.
I'm just looking at the clock, and this has just flown for me. I don't know about you guys, but Carla's put a point here about adaptive leadership, bring the skills for unlocking the potential in people. You know, and on reflection, I think for those of you who know Kmart in Australia and New Zealand, that was adaptive leadership, because that was a business that had lost money literally for 10 years in a row. New leadership team came in, headed up by Guy Russo, the best leader I've ever met. And the same people, like they didn't transform the business by sacking everyone. These same people who had been low engagement or worse were suddenly transformed into the most loyal people and proud people. And, you know, prior to COVID, $500 million in profit every year. I mean, Australia's leading retailer, the same people. Now that's the outcome, I think. And what you're, I think, referencing, Carla. Yeah. Look, we've got a couple of minutes left.
Yeah, exactly. We've got a few minutes. Let me summarize then the point that I've been trying to make. And two main points. The first is we need to stop using the language of how do we get back to normal. That's not going to happen. It's not going to happen in the next 12 to 18 months. And because it's going to be 12 to 18 months of deep disruption, patterns are going to change. Some industries are going to be brutally impacted and will never be able to recover. I wouldn't want to be in the airline industry right now, for example. It's tough to see how some, I mean, I know Virgin Australians are already been hit. You know, so there are some places that are just not going to survive this, and some things that are never going to come back. From simple things like, I don't think we're going to shake hands again too regularly, not with strangers anyway.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just a silly example. But I also think on the flip side, a lot of us are never going to go back to our offices. And there's going to be massive open offices in CBDs, which is going to impact corporate rentals, which is going to impact the property sector. Some of us are going to have to move to bigger houses because now we need a home studio at home. And so the property market's going to be changed, and so on and so on and so on. So now we could go into another whole hour of examples of business case studies. And if any of you want some of those or would like some help with your industries, that's what I do. So, feel free to contact me. But all of those are just examples of the fact that there isn't a normal to go back to in the short term, and even the long-term normal is going to look very different. So the second thing then to say is start dealing with it now. The picture I have of Australians, and I think the picture Australians have of South Africans, is of the battler, the Aussie battler. And the first thing the Aussie battler does is whine for about an hour, okay? Crack open a beer and whine. But then you get over it, right? You get over it quickly, you dust yourself off, you pick yourself up, and you get on with it. And I think we're in a little bit of the whining phase at the moment, and it's time to just face reality and step up and start dealing with it. And what that means is not trying to get back to some facsimile version of normal in your business, in your team, in your leadership style, in your approach. It might mean changing your company targets, accepting a slightly lower productivity so that you keep health and wellness going. It might mean putting training in for Zoom, because you can't just expect people to know how to use it properly. It might mean changing your customer and your staff engagement processes. It probably means changing your leadership style. Get on with it now already, because this is the new reality, and the people who start doing this soonest are going to come out of this best. So get into your opportunity mindset now and play the game that's in front of you. I think if you take that message away and do something with it, you'll have a better day and a better week.
So now each of you knows why I was so excited about having Graeme on. So really wonderful insights, Graeme. If there is an upside to this, it is that at least for people in Graeme's business, like me, but certainly for Graeme as well, geographical boundaries are no longer. So you can see that Graeme is fully equipped to be able to work with people, and that's what he's doing. He's been very busy doing this, working with organisations over the past couple of months. So if people want to reach out to you, Graeme, how do they make contact with you?
You know what? Let me just throw this up as a slide then, just as the last thing. Just search for Graeme Codrington. Any spelling version you can find of that will work. Or have a look at our company's website, Tomorrow Today Global. So we look at tomorrow first and help people deal with the implications for today second. So tomorrowtodayglobal.com, and they'll be able to link into myself and my team. And Steve, we're putting videos up kind of every day, every second day via my YouTube channel or our company's YouTube channel, all available for free. A lot of the stuff I've said today is available for free. I know you have recorded this, and we're both going to post it up on our channels for people to share it with their teams and with everybody else. So please be in touch. And if I can say the same back to Steve, I accepted the invitation to have a chat, and in fact even have arranged for Steve to come into my channels next week to chat, because I'm convinced, as you heard in our conversation, I'm convinced that leadership and workplace culture are going to be big themes in the second half of 2020 as companies realize they can't just let it happen by accident. And Steve, I've been a huge fan over many years of the work you guys have done on UGRs, the unwritten ground rules concept and approach. And I think it's going to be more valuable now than ever as people are deliberate about saying, in a virtual world, in a world we've never lived in before, we can't just let culture emerge and happen on its own. We need to be deliberate. And it's not a fluffy, iffy thing. You guys have shown that it can be codified, it can be discussed, and it can be engaged with. And I hope people take that seriously as well.
Oh, it's very kind of you, Graeme. Thank you. And it's also very kind of you to have spent an hour with us. So I know that everyone's gained a great deal. We've already got comments coming in from a number of people, Graeme, that you can see in the chat box. So people have really appreciated your insights, and I've really enjoyed it too. It's gone quickly for me. I don't know about the rest of you, but that went very quickly, which is a great sign.
For me too. Steve, can I just say something? Somebody's asked, when can we have more of this? And the answer might be that you've got some upcoming stuff. I'm just going to put a link directly. Steve and I, as Steve said in the introduction, we're part of an international group of speakers and experts and consultants who all deal with this kind of stuff. And we keep in touch all around the world. And we're kind of spending the next few weeks having conversations with each other. We are fascinated by each other's work and the work that we do. And we feel that each of the people in this group has something to say to organizations at the moment. So I'm setting up, if you go and have a look at my website, grahamcodrington.com/webinars, you'll see a list of some of the upcoming webinars that we're having, including another conversation Steve and I will be having next week as it happens. So yeah, please be in touch, stay connected, and connect into some of these conversations that we're having. But now, as I'm sure with all of you, we've got places to go, people to see, and other webinars to attend. So thank you very much for being with us for the last hour.
Thanks a lot, folks. Bye for now.